Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is Glossy Philosophy. My name is Jansen Binman and today you are tuned in for a book chat. So today's book we are talking about the second installment of Erin Morgenstern, and when I say installment I really just mean her second book. She is the author who wrote Night Circus, which is an amazing book and such a great book for the fall season. But she followed it up with the Starless Sea, which has absolutely nothing to do with Night Circus, but is also kind of on the same wavelengths. So let's kind of dive into a quick summary and then things you should look up for, things that I found really interesting, and all that good stuff. So a quick summary is going to be kind of tricky because if you've read Night Circus, then you know that Erin Morgenstern loves to travel throughout time. And she also loves to travel from character to character and see the same story from different perspectives, which is very interesting. So a couple things to just think about as we are going through the summary. I'm not going to tell you a complete synopsis because I don't want to ruin the ending, but basically you're jumping between a story and real life and magic. Okay, so a brief synopsis. Zachary Ezra Rollins is the main character of the story, and we find him on a college campus. He is there during basically like J term, and he's reading a book. He finds another book in the local library, or at the college library, the university library, that seems a little strange, and the more he reads it, the more he starts to think, wait a minute, this story is about me. Like, these things happen to me. And even though he's not specifically named as Zachary Ezra Rollins, he is basically named because the book seems to know things about him that maybe he didn't even know about himself, but things that have happened in his life are the exact same way. So in a way, this book is his book about him. But it's not just about him, it's also about a bunch of other different cast of characters. It has to deal with lots of love, loss of love, time travel, things like that. So obviously, if you pick up a book like that, that's going to be a little confusing, and that's exactly how Zachary Ezra Rollins feels. So he immediately tries to figure out what is going on. Is someone tracking him? Is he like in the Matrix? What's happening? He goes to a party. He meets two different people. Well, three, but he really only thinks he meets two. And both of them are very interesting and somehow connected to this book. One is a woman named Mirabelle, and he later calls her Max, and she basically takes him on an incredible adventure. The other one is named Dorian, and he ends up being the love interest, which is an interesting twist. Erin Morgenstern, just kind of a side note, has dealt with same-sex couples before in Night Circus, and it's kind of nice to see her dealing with that again in the Starless Sea, but it's never, her love relationships are never like over the top. They never take over the story with the feelings and physicality that can happen with love. It's always kind of like that stuff happens, but here's the real story, which I think is pretty cool. So after the party, things just kind of go bananas. Basically, Zachary Ezra Rollins gets dragged into this, we'll just call it a magical world of books and stories, and he's just trying to figure out what is real, what is not real. Is he allowed to stay in this magical world, which seems actually pretty cool, or does he have to return to real life and wait a minute, he isn't even really sure he wants to go back to his real life because he's just a university student and he's not exactly sure what he's doing with his life. So he seems to find purpose in this magical world, and the adventures continue to build until he is basically no longer himself and he has become a character within the many layers of story, and then the end is a surprise. So that is a quick synopsis of the story. And so a couple things to think about as you are reading this. This is my second time reading this book, and the second time was much more enjoyable for me than the first time. First of all, the first time I read this book, I was like very tired because I had just had my second kiddo and I was pumping, and reading this with half a brain is not a good idea because of all the time traveling and world traveling and character hopping that you do within her books. So if you are in that same situation, just hold off. It is an excellent book, but you will enjoy it so much more after you are able to sleep a little bit more and put things together. So the second reading was much more enjoyable, also because I knew the ending and I kind of knew who people were, because people get revealed to you throughout this book. It also just became a lot more understandable. So you definitely want to read this at least twice to get as much goodie as you can out of this book. And I want to read it again. Probably I'm going to give myself a couple months break, and then I'm going to read it again and just kind of see, even now that I have more knowledge of the characters and what's going on in the plot and all of that, am I going to take anything else away from it? And I think I will. I think this is definitely a book that you can read so many times and find something interesting or something that you missed each time. Another thing to think about as you are reading this is it is so interesting that the main character is referred to by his full name at the beginning of every chapter that deals with him, until he basically loses himself within the story and he becomes a part of the story, and then he is referred to as the fortune teller's son instead of Zachary Ezra Rollins. On that note, make sure that you are paying attention to names. They play a big, big role in this story. So when you visit this magical storyland, it is obviously a place where people love stories, and some of the stories, like The Picture of Dorian Gray, that character kind of comes out in a different version, or people will name themselves after literary characters. But Erin Morgenstern paid special attention to how she was naming the characters. So Zachary Ezra Rollins, look up what the names mean, and that will further enlighten you into the story. Same thing with, the character Dorian is from Dorian Gray, which they even reference as kind of a side note within the story. But just everything. Okay. And then the last thing that you should really pay attention to, so because we're time hopping a lot, we're character hopping, really, really pay attention to the chapters. Are you reading part of the book or someone else's book? Are you reading a journal? Are you reading something that is happening right now in the moment? That will just save you so much mental pain. Just trust me on that, because again, there's so much hopping that it can get a little frazzling, especially if you aren't fully sleeping yet. So those are just a couple things to pay attention to when you're reading this book. And there are so many layers, just as there are so many layers within the magical book story world. It is a very complicated story and a very complicated book, but it is so good. And even the first time I was reading it on half a brain, I still enjoyed it, but it took me a lot longer to actually get into the book than this time. I thought it was just so great right away. If you struggle with hopping from character to character and from book to book, you might want to think about taking some notes And I mean, there are definitely stories in here that I don't fully understand what they're actually about. She does try to have the characters discuss, like, hey, what does this actually mean? And why is the story being told so many times in slightly different ways and variations? She tries to explain it to us and like reveal it as we go along, but I definitely still have questions. And the second time reading it, she does do a really good job of slowly revealing what is going on after you already know what's going on, but it's still a little confusing. So I really like this book. I'm going to read it again. I own this book. I think Erin Morgenstern is brilliant. I think she's especially brilliant at building three-dimensional worlds, three-dimensional characters, and incorporating magic and kind of fantasy into real world events so that you, as the reader, get swept up into these worlds, and you can, like, you know, if they're at a ball, you can see all these people and the gold, and just like you feel like you're there with Zachary Ezra Rollins and Dorian, and you feel like you're really experiencing things that the characters are experiencing. And even when you're reading a story that the characters are reading, the story is still interesting, even if it's like a folk tale or something like that. It's just really well written. Are there some holes? I think there are a few holes, but again, the story is so complicated in so many layers, I'm not entirely sure I've fully digested it this time either. I was looking up, I have this major question, which I'm just gonna say, why the bees? Okay, so bees play a major, major role in this book, and I'm still trying to figure out why. So I was looking up information if anyone else had kind of posted about that, and I did see that she wrote a book, like a companion book, how to understand the Starless Sea. So I think a lot of people are kind of struggling with certain things. But it's great. She's brilliant, and I really think that you should give it a shot. And I also think if you haven't read The Night Circus, you have to read that. So I would read Night Circus first. It's much easier to understand, and then I would read The Starless Sea. And if you want to like be super bookwormy and nerdy, then you should take a lot of the books that they mention or stories that they mention within the magical storyland, and you should read those if you haven't. Like Picture of Dorian Gray is just so good. I also know that she mentioned a couple video games because Zachary Ezra Rollins is a gamer, and a couple of the other characters are too. So if you haven't played a role-playing game, it might be really fun to do that as well afterwards. I am not a gamer, but I have played role-playing games before, and especially when I was younger, I really liked them. So I could kind of follow that, and it's not really that violent. It is violent. There are elements of violence, but it's not grotesque, and it's not like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna get that out of my brain kind of gross, okay? But there are elements of adult violence, so keep that in mind. And that's kind of really all I can say about the Starless Sea. It's great, it's poetic, and the more I think about it, the more I feel like I'm just hearing poetry, not necessarily from Erin Morgenstern, but it reminds me of poetry. I think it was Alfred Lord Tennyson who wrote The Lady of Shalott, and the opening of that just reminds me a lot of this, where he says, "There she weaves by night and day a magic web of colors gay. A curse upon her if she stay, the Lady of Shalott." Because it is all about weaving these characters in and out of all their different stories and all the stories into one thing. And that poem just reminds me a lot of this. So look that up too if you want to, and check out The Starless Sea. I highly recommend it. It's It's great. Enjoy, and I will see you very soon for another book chat. Make sure you hit that thumbs up and a subscribe button. I do fashion videos every Wednesday, I do beauty videos every Friday, and sometimes I do book chats. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!